Well, hi, Jerome. Thank you again so much for making time today. As I think you know, you're greatly missed here in Manitoba from your old stomping grounds. So I'm Rob Santos. The Manitoba School Boards Association has invited me to facilitate these conversations with the community about the all-important topic of representation on school boards. And so we're really pleased to have your generosity and your time for the next 30 minutes or so. We'd really love to tap your experience and expertise as an educational leader to speak to this issue. And as I think you're aware, we were hoping you could kind of give us perspectives at different levels, those multi-level influences from the macro of society all the way to the micro of the classroom would be a wonderful perspective for our audience, which are all the school trustees for all the school boards in the province of Manitoba. So starting at that societal or educational system level, thinking very big picture, in your experience, what is the single largest barrier to individuals from marginalized communities being represented in school divisions?
First, Rob, thanks for having me. Let me say tanse, kanche, bonjour, and hello to my colleagues in Manitoba. And I really do appreciate Manitoba School Boards Association reaching out to me. I think in terms of one of the biggest obstacles in terms of having racialized and minoritized people represented on school boards is that sense of belonging. We live in a society in Canada and in Manitoba with deep roots in terms of racism being used as a mechanism and means to keep people out of communities, out of society, out of certain professions. And I think that the strong forces that have existed for centuries, where people don't feel like they belong, that their voice is actually valued, that there's a space for them to contribute, is probably one of the biggest socio-historical factors that works against what school boards hope to do, which is to have a diversity of voices, perspectives, across the spectrum from Manitoba. To sit at tables and help contribute to decisions that are made.
Yeah, exactly. And that sense of belonging is, I guess, even more challenged these days as we're more cut off from each other in different ways. So you've had experience at so many different levels of the education system. Can you say a bit more sort of from your perspective as an administrator in both the K-12 education system from your days as a principal, for example, all the way now to the Dean of Education at the University of Regina. Those are quite unique vantage points from both direct administration of the direct education of children all the way to the training of our future educators. How does that belonging play out in those spheres from your experience?
Yeah, and one of the things that I'll also note is I learned a lot from my partner in life who spent 3 years as an elected trustee here in Saskatchewan. And I learned a lot about school boards and the hard work that school boards do. And again, an attempt to understand and gain perspectives of folks who typically don't get heard. So I think one of the challenges is, first and foremost, a lack of representation, in the teaching workforce. In faculties of education, the work that I'm doing here and that colleagues are doing in Manitoba and across the country to try and actually have a workforce of hardworking, committed people who we want as teachers, but who also represent the diversity that we find in schools and that we find in communities. So from the ground up, we have to start to build a sense that anyone who wants to be a teacher can, including people who don't necessarily see themselves right now represented in the teaching workforce. So at the ground level, even in K-12 schools, we know that one of the biggest influencers on young people's decisions to become teachers are their actual teachers. And so when young people don't see themselves reflected in the teaching workforce, they do get a sense that maybe they don't belong. We can go back to, the 1950s and 60s in the US and some of the barriers that were broken by Jackie Robinson, and in Canada by some of the hockey players who were the first, in a lifetime to break through that barrier. If we look at the US elections and Kamala Harris, shattering not just a gender barrier, but a racial barrier. So, representation, it does matter. In faculties of education, it matters that that the faculty members, you know, reflect and represent the student body. In schools, it matters that administrators reflect the diversity of school communities, same at central office, and importantly, and I think most importantly at the school board level, you know, the school board are representatives from the community. They carry the hopes and the aspirations of community members. And if, you know, you're a racialized person and you don't see people sitting around the table who have the same life experience, who face the same sorts of struggles and challenged, you do start to wonder whether or not those things are being surfaced at those meetings. So at every single level, it matters. I'm a dean of education. There are 53 faculties of education in Canada, English language faculties of education, and I'm one of 3 racialized people in the country. It's disproportionately low, and so there's work to do, you know, to represent, to do the work, and to recognize that diversity matters. It matters a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And so with that, the importance of a sense of belonging in mind, of, as you say, of the importance of valuing all those voices, and then the opportunity, but also the challenge of creating places and spaces where people see themselves reflected. And your example is our most recent and timely one, I guess, in North America with the US election and all the dynamics in our sister jurisdiction. So with those important aspects in mind, and with our audience in mind here, these elected school trustees, as you know, they're elected in Manitoba. You're also aware of the various legislative parameters, of course, that give opportunities as well, but may be limiters, at least in their current formulation. What are some sort of practical or things you've observed or seen to be successful as ways, as mechanisms of engaging, of increasing that reflection of diversity, of the demographics, of the cultural makeup of a community within those parameters, including how do you get people to participate in a democracy? How do you get people to run for elected office, such as a trustee? So with, you know, what are some thoughts you might share with the trustees here on these matters?
Sure, absolutely. I think it ends up being, you know, typically what we say, which is, you know, both a top down and a bottom up type approach that we need to take. So, you know, as you point out, rightfully so, you know, there are legislative and regulatory restrictions in terms of, you know, elections and how we organize elections. And I think there is work to be done to take a look at whether or not some of those rules, procedures continue to disadvantage certain segments of the community. You know, again, borrowing from other jurisdictions, you know, how do you get nominated? How do you get people to support you as you go through the process? You know, are there places for some appointed trustees in combination with elected trustees? So I think there are, at the higher level, policy, legislative areas, places where trustees can start to take a look at, you know, those structures that exist that continue to place obstacles and barriers in the minds and then the realities of people who would like to aspire. I think at the other end, you know, being able to spend time in communities that quite often don't get invited to, you know, the proverbial board table to talk, you know, using sort of a very old school model, but one that works well, I think, in particular with school boards who represent local voices, is to use, you know, town hall, community gatherings. You know, from a political point of view, it's old school caucusing. You know, we used to have these caucuses where you would meet with, you know, with groups of people. And in one sense, we vilified them because now we call them special interest groups, as if special interest groups themselves are inherently bad. But sometimes there are special interest groups who actually have just a few key concerns that they really want to know have surfaced at the table. And I think for trustees to recognize that you are the voice, you know, you're the only opportunity sometimes for people to have what matters to them represented at the board table. And so, you know, making and taking opportunities to hold things like town hall. And I think, you know, one of the things that COVID has given us as an opportunity is to hold town halls virtually in our faculty of education. We've been holding a lot of town halls that people otherwise wouldn't be able to get to because of the geographic location. And It also provides a bit of a safe space for some people to be able to surface and have conversations that they haven't had before. So I think it's, working at both ends of the spectrum. And I think for trustees, listening carefully to, again, what people in communities want represented at the table. And I think trustees are well positioned. In some ways, I think they're better positioned than some of the provincial elected officials, because local trustees do represent relatively small geographic areas, smaller communities. And I think, again, breaking it down to smaller town hall, coffee shop type meetings where you go and spend time and listen to what matters to a local segment of your community matters a lot.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful idea that you just said about the each trustee almost being a voice for those other voices at all those important tables. And that statistic you quoted is on my mind that you just mentioned as dean. I guess less than maybe 6% across the country as just one particular group of educational leadership. So I know from previous conversations we've had that you've sometimes both felt and literally have been maybe one of those unitary or lone voices with a racialized perspective at the table. Can you say a bit more about what that's been like and some of the challenges, I guess, that might range from tokenism to maybe the risk of overgeneralizing, one individual's voice to represent entire communities of people?
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. I think that with the hard work, and I mean it in the sense of generosity, the good work that trustees want to do, it's exactly avoiding that trap, that bias, that because you've listened to a few people of color or a couple of Indigenous people or a couple of Black people, that somehow you get to carry the voice of the entire community. And I think it's recognizing that each and every one of us as human beings, whether we are Black, Indigenous, a person of color, or white, we have a unique life experience and a life trajectory that takes us in different directions. One of the things I think we all share, though, is a commonality for what we hope is there for our kids and our grandkids. And I think it's a matter of listening to individuals, taking individual conversations, having listened carefully, and surfacing, are there some themes? Are there some commonalities? Are there some things that surface? Are there some anomalies? Do some of the folks in these communities have something to say that stands out from the norm? And for myself, it's been a challenge. It's been a challenge sometimes to go to meetings with people who are committed to the educational enterprise, but whose life experience has privileged them in a way that they haven't had to fight some of the fights I've had to fight. They haven't been confronted with some of the obstacles. I'm fortunate, incredibly fortunate, to have been given some opportunities in life and through work to be able to surface a voice. And I think that when I think of trustees, it's actually that work that trustees have an opportunity to do. It is literally about this generation that are in school and the next generation and the generation that comes after that. And I think being able to not overgeneralize, to listen to individual voices, but to carry those voices to the board table becomes fundamentally important work for trustees.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful reminder of the issue of who speaks for whom, I guess, in a democratic setting, including in the education system. And so you mentioned students, and if you could kind of go into that student level now a little bit, from all the hats that you've worn in serving young people in the system of education, both in their learning, but also, as you mentioned earlier, opportunities for within a school division perhaps, or as teachers, as a possible career future for them, from the different ages all the way to the students in your faculty. Like, what are some thoughts that you've had over the years and now that you might offer to the trustees on that matter?
Well, I'll share with the trustees a brief story. When I became a teacher and was toured through the school that I was going to begin my career in, I was introduced to a grade 4 class who were going to become my grade 5 class, and wonderful, wonderful young people. And the principal introduced me to the class, said, "This is Mr. Cranston." And typical as kids, some were listening, some weren't. Conversation went for a couple of minutes. A young man, student, put up his hand and asked the principal towards the end of the introduction if I was going to be the school's new bus driver. Because for that young child, the only person of color he had encountered up to that point in time probably drove a bus. So the principal was somewhat embarrassed. But again, it's not a matter of me sloughing it off. Matter of fact, I knew that my work was in front of me. I knew that it was important work for these kids. I mean, they're literally children, and they're asking a question really out of innocence and not knowing. But how important that becomes, in this particular case, the student was white. So for this young man to learn that teachers actually come in a variety of colors and genders and sizes and shapes, how important that is. And I think that speaks to what we need to do in the K-12 system with young people to open up their eyes to who could become teachers, right? Not just for students who are racialized, but for white students also, to see the possibility of literally anyone can become a teacher, that this is a profession and a possibility for anyone. And I think that's one of the real benefits of diversity. I think sometimes we think of diversity and the benefits of targeted hiring really benefiting those students who have been marginalized, left out, and don't see themselves represented. I think there's an equal benefit to the majority segment of society to be able to actually come to a deeper appreciation for the gifts that we all bring as possible teachers.
Yeah, exactly. That's what really struck me with that wonderful story, is how important it is, I guess, primarily for the young people, the students, but really for everyone involved in the educational enterprise, to be able to see those possibilities. And we sometimes forget, which is, you just gave us a lovely reminder, that this is important to all, both the majority and the minority members of a particular community. Could you say a bit more? You mentioned it just now. Again, maybe as an administrator or somebody who has a great track record at building great teams and being part of great teams to deliver quality education. And over the years, of course, there's been everything from affirmative action to current employment equity policies. How do we find the balance, and how do we ensure that both those values, which you've talked about, and I think Manitoban share as well, around both excellence but also diversity, equity, and representation, how do we make that more of a reality?
I think one of the things we have to realize is there's a lot of talented people out there who are interested in becoming teachers, and that the bars that we set need to be fair, but they need to be fair in a sense of equity also. And so I would never suggest that we open up the teaching profession to just anyone who feels like they want to do it. I think there is a minimum qualification that's required to come in. But outside of that, I think we have to really think differently around, what constitutes our assessment of the best fit. A lot of times best fit has been used to exclude people. We use somewhat narrow definitions of organizational culture and organizational fit to keep people out. And so I think that, for trustees, for senior leaders in school divisions, to really spend some time unpacking what they mean by, who's the most qualified, what's required to become the most qualified. So in terms of my own work, I've done a fair amount of work trying to create pathways, open doors, build bridges for groups who typically don't get access to things like graduate degrees, graduate diplomas. In my own work as an academic, as a scholar, I purposely reach out to grad students who are Indigenous, who are Black, and spend a lot of time working with them, mentoring them to become more fluent writers, not to disadvantage white students, but to make sure that those students who have never been given the extra opportunities, the extra pieces that would allow them to compete fairly, are given fair footing. And so quite often in work that I do, I paraphrase a quote that was given by a former president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, who talked about bringing two people to a race and saying, if we expect someone who's been shackled by chains for hundreds of years to be at the starting line with someone who's been given all the opportunity to train and eat well and perform well, and we, fire the starter's gun and say, okay, race, and expect that the results will be anything other than what you can predetermine, we're foolish. And so, the whole notion of, as you point out, employment equity, it's based on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It says that we have socio-historical groups in Canada who have been disadvantaged, and that a point at which we will achieve justice for all will be achieved when we have shifted the balances, the scales of justice, to allow those who have been historically held back to have some level of advantage. And at some point, we'll bring this thing to rest. And at that point in time, we'll have a healthier society. So I think for trustees, it's a matter, and senior leaders, senior administrators, to take a look at how we do some of this measuring and assessing.
Yeah, exactly. And that important precept almost of ensuring that the race is fair for all really resonates, I guess, too, because just thinking about the origins of the universal public education system itself is premised on this idea that all are deserving of a quality education and of a fair start, and really keeping a notion both equal and equitable opportunities, like you've just mentioned. So I could just listen to you for hours, Jerome, but I know our time is short. So in the last few minutes we have together, this is your chance to offer sort of some parting wisdom, a last thought, if you will, to all the trustees here. And I think the broader audiences that I know will be very interested in listening to this and the other conversations with the community. So what are your hopes as you look ahead to the coming year 2021 for representation at the divisional level, from your perspective?
Sure. Well, I'm a huge supporter of the work that locally elected school trustees, board members do, because I think it's one of the vestiges of what we had always hoped for in terms of local governance. I think that, even with the series of amalgamations that we've seen in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, it's still in some ways the closest form of local democracy we have. And I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic from my experience of being a partner to one, but working with a number of trustees, that trustees do understand that. I think that, we're being challenged right now, not just during this pandemic, but through the pandemic, with many of the cracks that exist in our social network and our social system. And I think education is one of the places where we can make a profound difference. And it isn't to sugarcoat or gloss over the challenges that exist in terms of budget and in terms of, limited resources, but it's one of the few places where people still place a lot of trust and hope. And I remain optimistic. I often say that this enterprise that we've gotten ourselves into, education, it's premised on hope. It's premised on optimism. It's premised on trust. And I think the people in the system, teachers, administrators, senior administrators, trustees, they take that seriously. And I think we've got the right people, in the general sense, we've got the right people, because this is not a profession where the rewards necessarily come in the form of hard, tangible dollars and cents and those sorts of things. It's an opportunity to make a profound difference in society. And I remain optimistic that educators across the spectrum will respond.
Exactly. Well, Professor Cranston, as always, it's been a pleasure. So thank you so much for your time today on behalf of the Manitoba School Boards Association.
Merci. Thanks, Rob. I appreciate it.
Take care.